Have your attention please. I'm very proud to introduce Denis Barry. He was born in Parish Street in 1939. He certainly doesn't look it. He's educated at St. Nesson's in Sullivan's Quay Primary and Secondary School, went on to the School of Commerce, was a qualified chartered secretary in 1964, worked in the Munster Arcade from 58 to 68, and on Munster Cock Shoe Company from 68 to 75, and finally in Pepsi 75, and actively retired in 74. She did. Who the boss was
This belief is an old also that we will offer in con leert scar hoort skel mogelijk als voor de willingness. I've been introduced to Denis Barry. I'm a nephew of Commandant Denis Barry, who up to comparatively recent years we know him in the family as the Unknown Commandant. And the more we researched, the more we found out. And it seems to be a common thread running through Irish history. The select few are remembered, and the forgotten majority are just forgotten about. And I think one of the things that will go forward from today's session here is that we must do something in our generation to remember the men, women and boys who brought us the freedom we had, which unfortunately at the moment is compromised to Europe. But the reality is we'll always be Irish. We'll always have what my uncle had and many more, thousands like him. I gave to Gary this morning a list of all the Cork volunteers who signed up for the volunteer movement. That is available actually in the archives in Blackpool. But Gary is going to copy the copy I gave him, and I'm sure it will be part and parcel of future exhibitions and meetings of the volunteers. It's overdue for the volunteer movement to resurrect. It died, unfortunately, and other than the good work of these people, the reality is that this generation will have passed on, and it would be just as if we were talking about Brian Boru. It would mean nothing to anyone. So I start. My uncle was born in Cullen River Stick, which is about 10 miles from the city centre. He was part of a family of 10. They had a fairly large farm, 125, 130 acres almost. Now Cullen River Stick is, you go through the village of River Stick and you turn off left. It's pretty good country. It's very big families. And one thing I want to point out is that the Barry farm is 130 acres. But right around us we had denominations of every description. And contrary to what we see and hear on our daily Sunday papers, there was no animosity between different religious groups. In fact, we spent quite a lot of our youth playing with Church of Ireland people who had residence in the rectory in Cullen. And obviously with 10 of them there, something had to happen. And something did happen in the sense that the family started moving on. Din came to Cork at the age of 13, was in and out to his sisters in Barrack Street, 25 Barrack Street. To those who remember Barrack Street, you're talking about John Henson's corner, which is, the first corner was Jerry White's corner, the next one was Henson's corner. We lived in that house as well, but Din lived there. His first thing was that he joined the trade union movement in 1909, and I still have his union membership cards right up to 1913. He looked at joining the AOH organisation, but he wasn't particularly happy with the outlooks and things that they believed in. They were great people for having little posters, but the background wasn't great. He joined the volunteers June 1914 and became very active in the Gaelic League, and most people that time, most houses, and the census will show it, spoke Irish and English. not full Irish or full English. It was usually a mixture of some. And I really think it's a shame we don't do the same thing today, like Goramahagut, Diesmuragut, Slanagut, the little small felicitations and greetings to people in our own native tongue. It will give us a sense of pride within ourselves. It's not giving you a badge of nationalism. That's not the purpose of it. Din was asked to go to Kilkenny in 1915 by Tréad Maxina and Tomás McCurtain. And the reason for that was they wanted somebody of his capabilities of organising the Old Dignaherin in Kilkenny. He did quite a good job to the extent that on the 2nd of May 1916 he was arrested he claimed himself in a letter to his brothers and sisters that there was actually a full battalion of English soldiers arrested him. He was detained in Kilkenny barracks for 9 days and transferred with 7 other Kilkenny people to Dublin, to Richmond barracks. And of course in Richmond barracks that time you had all the volunteers who were captured as a result of Area Corcaigh and Neither Shadea. He was transferred with them all over to Frangog, and he spent a relatively short time in Frangog. But when he came back to Kilkenny, he was as active as he always was in the Republican movement, which really was Sinn Féin at that time, or the Irish Volunteers, whichever way you wanted to look at it. He was election agent for a, shall we say, W.T. Cosgrave. I will not put any tab on him. In the successful election of 1918, he was recalled to Cork in late 1918, and he became very, very active in the running of the volunteers in Cork. So much so that he was made a commandant in late 1918. 1919, the first Dáil met, and in the June 19, they decided, look, the RIC are gone, law and order is broken down, we've got to do something about this. And an organisation called the Irish Republican Police was set up. Now it was set up, it was structured on the battalion structure of the volunteers. Consequently, the commandant of a particular company was automatically OC of the Republican Police. In fact, he was the head of the police in Cork, and that was embracing the Cork 1st and 2nd battalions. He had people naming Fitzgerald as his deputy right-hand man, not the Fitzgeralds of Knockgraha, but still a Limerick man. And they became extremely close friends. In fact, at the tail end of the story, you'll see how close it was. The Civil War, unfortunately, was the greatest disaster that this country has seen. Because friends became enemies, enemies became murderers on both sides. Very strange things happened, things that normally wouldn't happen, but the bitterness was so great that father and son fought, and father and son killed either of each one. Din was arrested in Courtown Harbour after the fall of Cork. He was with Liam Lynch on the Cumberland Mountains when Liam Lynch was killed. Liam Lynch was an extraordinary commander. We tend to look to General Tom Barry, which, fair play, was a hell of a man. But Liam Lynch was really something extremely human for a guy who led the troops. His dying wish was that he would be buried next to Mick Fitzgerald in Kilcrumper Cemetery. Now that's an extraordinary thing for a man who was the leader of the Republican Army. He wanted to be buried next to Mick Fitzgerald, who was a trade union official in Fermoy and who died in a hunger strike in Corcaigh after 72 days. But that was Liam Lynch's dying wish. Din was arrested in Courtown and he was transferred up to Newbridge. And he spent 14 months in Newbridge internment camp. A hunger strike was called in October 1923 on the basis that they were getting nowhere. They were interned without trial, without charge, without anything, living in the most appalling conditions. My uncle joined the hunger strike, and 34 and a half days later, he died. He died in the Corcaigh hospital. He was shifted there on Monday, and he died on Monday night. The family had been alerted that he was in pretty poor shape. Now, there had been speculation that relatively 34 days was a very short time in terms of hunger strikes. But the life was so hard there, and he had been moving about, I won't say on the run, moving about for nearly 3 years, and obviously it took a toll on his health. Now, the other side of that coin, and I've heard it said, and I've seen it on some of the paper sheets at the time, Ava and the Irish Nation, suggestions made that he was being force-fed. No, I don't believe that, because, to be honest with you, being force-fed so soon after Thomas Ashe's death would not have been realistic. No, they tried a lot of things, but they still had 11,000 Republicans in internment camps. Now, the story degenerates from here, because you'd say, how can a man who'd done so much could be deprived of so little with so much at the same time? So much in the sense that after 3 days and an inquest, which the Free State government said he wouldn't have an inquest, he was going to be put into an orange type box and buried in a place called the Glass House in Corcaigh. And that actually happened. He was buried at a site called the Glass House. Now, unfortunately, you can't get near that at the moment because it's quite near a military prison, and they won't even allow you to take photographs, so it wasn't in my book. The family went to the High Court, as was consisted of meeting actually the Master of the Rolls, and they made an application called mandamus, and that means actually to produce the body to the family. And the judge deferred the decision until Monday. Now, I wanted to bring in another person here called Andy O'Sullivan. Andy also died on hunger strike 2 days after my uncle. Andy was an extraordinary character. He was actually employed by the British as an agricultural agent in Mallow. He did more things than that. In fact, he was on his way to America with Sean O'Toma, and he was arrested because he was identified by the railway porter. And he was arrested and put into Mountjoy, and he died 2 days after my uncle. He was brought back to Mallow, got a full military funeral, was buried in the Republican plot in Mallow. Originally he was a cabin man. My uncle, on the hunger strike was then called off late Sunday night, and the application went to the court, but at that stage the provisional government that was there decided the family could have the body. His body was exhumed and taken to Naas, and here is where the situation gets worse. Word went out that the Bishop of Cork, Dr. Lucy, would not allow his body into any Catholic church in the Diocese of Cork or Ross. He would not allow any Catholic priest officiate in any way, shape or form at any Christian burial service, as he referred to it. That was a very hard blow for the family to take, because he was 40 years of age. He'd given his life for Ireland. He fought with the people who were now denying him the right to have Christian burial, a decent burial. His mother was still alive, she was 8 years of age. That was a fairly heartbreaking situation. So on the Wednesday, his body was brought to Cork, and the edict was still in place. No Catholic church for Denis Barry. His body was brought in to the Sinn Féin headquarters in 56 Grand Parade. But people confuse that they think it's Fitzgerald's building. It's not. If you can think of the library at the moment, and right next to the library you have O'Sullivan's auctioneers. It's a bow-fronted building, and you have Irwin and Kilcullen solicitors. Now on the first floor there, the Sinn Féin headquarters was there, and that's where he was laid out on a table. And it's my understanding, or the story is told, that the table that the coffin was rested on was actually one retrieved from Sean Jennings, when Sean Jennings' place was actually burned the night that Cork was burned. Now something about Cork being burned and the Fitzgerald man from Limerick is that there were 62 people rescued from apartments in Patrick Street and all of the side streets. Never recorded in history, but it actually happened, and it was recorded by Mick Fitzgerald from Limerick, who had an interview on the 50th anniversary of the Rising, and that's the source of that story. The following morning, Thursday, Din's funeral left the Grand Parade at 11:30. His coffin was shouldered all the way down the Mall, across Parnell Place, onto McCurtain Street, and from there right around the top of the Grand Parade, almost directly opposite where the Capitol Cinema was. And the Cork Examiner at the time recorded that the head of the cortege was there, and the tail of the cortege was still only leaving the Sinn Féin rooms. That was the extent of the respect shown. All shops were closed, all cinemas and places of entertainment were closed at the request of the volunteer organisation. And there was no question of going around with revolvers demanding that people close down, because remember, the Free State government were in office at that time. In fact, there is one of the few papers that I haven't released yet. There was actually a description of a policeman saluting Din's coffin outside the courthouse. Now the courthouse was actually the effective temporary city hall. The funeral arrived at St. Finbar Cemetery at 6:30 on a November afternoon, and thanks to a very generous cemetery manager, provided them with lanterns. Maura Marcina and her sister Annie performed the prayers. David Cant blessed the grave with holy water, and Din was laid to rest in one of the big three mound graves in St. Finbar's. You have Trela Marcina, Tomas McCurtain, Donnacha De Barra. So that's who Donnacha De Barra was. His memory has been resurrected within the past 3 years. I published a book, and the Corner Day I have another book with additional information which I received from people who are interested. I hope to have that available for the 14th of June 2014, 100 years to the day after he joined the volunteers. There are a few items there that I want to bring to your attention. Patrick Hanley was an innocent Fianna Éireann man, and he was gunned down here in Broad Lane, as it was called. And today we're remembering Patrick Hanley as a Fianna Éireann man, as a young boy who, because he had connections with Fianna Éireann, you had the black and tans and the guys of RIC uniforms shot him in cold blood, nothing on, only his night clothes. So we remember Patrick today, and Patrick is buried in the Republican plot out in St. Finbar Cemetery. but he cannot be written out of Irish history. He's part of it. When young boys were giving their lives and elderly men were giving their lives, everybody put their tuppence worth in. We also want to remember the common man, the wonderful women. The women, my own mother-in-law, well, she wasn't my mother-in-law then, but she was Cis Moore. And believe it or not, she used to live in Ann Street, which isn't exactly too far away from here. And they moved to College Road after that. She was seriously injured in an explosion. It was badly burned in the shoulders, face, hands. And she lived to be 62. She had a fairly serious incapacity. The thing that troubles me most and drives me on is that in Cork, we don't know or we can't see that the war was won in Cork. We don't have a monument to the volunteers, to the Fine Gael, to the Common Man in this city of ours. We see plenty plasters around, you're entering, rebel country. Where's the rebellion gone? Where's the respect gone for those who gave their lives? To those who fought and were forced to go down to Queenstown Cove with a parcel of clothes and £5 and get on a ship and never heard of again. Those are the people we want to remember. And I have discussed it with Gary that we would make serious efforts to get a decent monument along the lines of basing it on the cross monument in the Republican plot with little pillows in front of it for 1, the volunteers, 2, Common Man, 3, Fine Gael. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the men and women and boys who have died or who died long after the war was over. They suffered in silence. They didn't get a bob, and most of them didn't look for a bob. And I can vouch for that, because when I started researching my book, I was frustrated at every hand's turn. I wrote to the military records in Renmore, and I was told they never heard of him. I went to historians here and they said, he died on hunger strike. That was it. But he was chief of the Republican police. And he was approached by a certain person called Duffy to sign himself out of the Republican movement. And he could join the civil guards at the same status as he was in the Republican police. But my uncle was not for turning, and a lot more. You see, the obvious thing was divide and conquer. And certain people learned that from the British way of doing things. But they forgot that the men and women and boys who took part in Corcaigh and Saoirse and unfortunately had to partake in the Civil War. The other thing that troubles me deeply, we're getting a lot of television bits about famous events or infamous events. It's very unlikely we'll see any television about Denis Barry, about Patrick Hanley, about all the volunteers and Common Man and Fine Gael in Cork. But the only way to beat that is to make an honest effort, and we owe it, to try and get a monument in the Grand Parade, not in some obscure place that can be locked up at night, out in the Grand Parade, preferably in front of the library where he worked, where other men worked. The Wallace sisters in Augustin Street. The Middle Parish has contributed more to the fight for freedom than many other parishes in Ireland. We can think of Master's Restaurant in Marlborough Street, the old GEA rooms in Cook Street. We can think of right here behind us, St. Francis Hall. These were all hubs where the volunteers got together and made their decision to go for it. When English were weak, we were strong, and we had the strength. We didn't have a lot of guns, but we had the strength and the determination to stand up to them, and successfully they did it. And the only way we could remember it, and let's not walk away from here today and say, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do something about it. No, I want to thank you. First of all, I want to thank Gary and the organisers of this exhibition for asking me to speak today. It's an honour and it's an opportunity for us all to get to know each other. Now, may I say that unfortunately I'm slightly restricted because I suffer from glaucoma, so my sight isn't great, but we keep going right up to the end. And if I live to see the day to see a monument, I'll die a very happy person. But I mean,